China goes west. Now this is thoughtful. Hello, I'm Trevor Lai in Shanghai. China's corporate champions have arrived. Consumers around the world are typing on Lenovo computers, storing their food in high-air refrigerators, and speaking on Huawei mobile phones. But how did products from these Chinese companies enter our daily lives? We'll find out this week on Thoughtful China by talking with Joel Backaler, Associate VP at Frontier Strategy Group and the author of a new book, China Goes West, Everything You Need to Know About Chinese Companies Going Global. The book offers an overview of Chinese companies' expansion into international markets and the opportunities and challenges it brings, and tells the story of why and how Chinese companies invest in developed countries in Europe and the US. And David Wolf, Managing Director of the Global China Practice at Allison+Partners, will share a thought or two about whether Chinese companies are ready to build global brands. Joel, welcome to our studio.
Thank you for having me, Trevor.
First of all, why did you write this book, China Goes West?
It's a very good question, Trevor. I mean, let's just start from the beginning. If you look at some of the statistics, China invested $85 billion internationally last year, and $14 billion of that ended up in the US. So contrary to popular belief, it's not just going in emerging markets. What we're seeing, though, is that this trend is set to increase dramatically over our lifetimes. Chinese companies are going global, and they're not going back. So it's extremely important right now that we get a very good understanding of what are the drivers behind this trend and what is it going to mean for each one of us. So that's really why I wrote the book.
And what is one key takeaway you would want your readers to walk away from after finishing the book?
Yeah, I think it's the fact that Chinese companies are going global, and we need to have a really good understanding about what it means for us. And I do this by answering a series of questions in the book. So first it looks at what are the differences between Chinese companies and American companies, especially as we're looking at comparing them to Western multinationals. Then it looks at why. So what are the reasons why Chinese companies want to go overseas? There's obviously government motivations, but there's a real business motivations as well. From there, it asks a very practical question, which is, are they even ready to go overseas? And from there, it goes into what are the paths that Chinese companies take? Is it outbound M&A, or is it looking at greenfield investments? It all builds up to essentially an assessment of what are the pros and cons of Chinese investment, and what does it mean for governments, what does it mean for companies, and what does it mean for consumers? And the book ends with a series of recommendations for how each of these parties can benefit and also essentially minimize the concerns to make sure that it can be as mutually beneficial as possible.
So you spent several years in Asia prior to writing the book, in Beijing, Taiwan, and Singapore. Was there a specific reader you had in mind that inspired you to start writing this and feeling as if you had to get this message across to a certain group?
It was really the Chinese companies that I worked with on an ongoing basis, especially when I was based in Beijing. I was working with state-owned companies, and quite frankly, it was something that I felt that as these companies wanted to go overseas, I found there were a series of relationships that they weren't getting right. So those are things like managing government relations, managing their employees, even understanding how to invest the right amount of capital over the long term. So I'll give you a couple examples. First, if you look at managing government relations, it's so important here in China to have a good relationship with the government and business. But in markets like the United States and Europe, it's really not the case. So you have a tendency for Chinese companies to want to rely on the US federal government or state government when they're investing overseas, when in reality, they should probably be working with professional services firms. The other side is, I think if you're looking at the relationship between companies and employees, you have a situation in which there tends to be much more of a centralized management approach here in China, whereas they're not really taking advantage of having a local presence. So over the course of my research, I interviewed several people who were heads of North America or heads of the United States. And at the beginning, they were very optimistic of the opportunity that their local operations had. By the time I actually finished writing my book, though, many of them left the company and they had been fired or they proactively left.
Within 2 years?
Within 2 years. And the reason behind this was, they said that they didn't have enough decision-making authority and there were unrealistic expectations from corporate headquarters here in China about what the market dynamics were on the ground. So they had unrealistic targets.
And were those individuals usually expatriates that had worked in the Chinese headquarters and then were essentially sent back to the US, or were they actually local Chinese that were sent overseas?
So that's the interesting thing, because as I looked at these executives, they had a fairly common profile. They weren't just a foreign face that was hired. These were industry veterans who had proven themselves in like other leading companies, and then they were essentially assigned to be the head of Europe or the head of North America. And so I think one of the key findings that I got from this is that as Chinese companies go overseas, not only do they need to hire some of these experienced local staff, but they also have to have people here at corporate in China that have an understanding of what it's like on the ground, because otherwise, you could have the most experienced person on the ground managing your operations, but if they don't have the right autonomy and they don't have the right decision-making authority, nothing's going to get done.
So having a cultural bridge within the company between the two countries or the two territories is essential to making it work. So in your view, why are Chinese companies now making a real push towards going global?
Yeah, so as I alluded to in my book, I think if you look at it, there's a government policy side, and then there's also a business necessity side. So on the government side, it's in the government's interest to essentially build national champions or companies in select number of industries that can really build and be globally competitive over the long term in international markets. Not only does this help with the companies themselves, but it also helps kind of gradually expand China's soft power in these international markets. At the same time, the government sits on about $4 trillion in US foreign exchange reserves. So investing in state-owned companies is a great way to help get that money out in a more controllable way. And in the process, achieve kind of that third area, which is securing natural resources that will help fuel the domestic economy here in China. But then, it's much more than the Zhou or the go out strategy. It's much more also around business necessity. The dynamics of the domestic operating environment here in China have changed dramatically in recent years. And it's not just Chinese companies, it's Western companies. So it's extremely competitive. Local talent is extremely difficult to manage. And, quite frankly, prices are increasing and there's overcapacity. So companies are going overseas because first, they're looking to get advanced technology that will make them more, I'd say, much more sophisticated internationally, but also more competitive here in China. Then they're also looking to get international management and management best practices, so kind of bring in that global view that we just talked about. Third, it's also getting global brands and kind of acquiring these brands like ThinkPad and Weetabix and some of these brand acquisitions that we've heard about, because these help kind of brand the trust gap when these Chinese companies go overseas for the first time, but then they also help kind of provide more of a dual premium low-end brand strategy as they enter some of these international markets in the US and EU. And then last, I'd just say it's really about kind of diversifying away from the Chinese market here. Like I said, it's extremely competitive, and so essentially by diversifying away from China and into other emerging markets or other developed markets, Chinese companies that are maybe in a sector that has overcapacity here or is an extremely competitive here can actually increase their margins and have a better outlook in a market that's more suitable for their current business.
Well, it's interesting, all of these factors that you've talked about parallel what we often talk to when we think about foreign companies coming into China, doing the homework, getting the foothold, understanding the culture, and really the big takeaway is a long-term strategy and a long-term plan. And it sounds like Chinese companies face the same challenges when they're going overseas as well.
Exactly.
Let's take a break to hear from our sponsor. And then David Wolf will share a thought or two about whether Chinese companies can really build global brands.
Now, let's go!
And fight!
Several years ago, I wrote an op-ed for Campaign magazine in Hong Kong that tried to answer a deceptively simple question. Can Chinese companies build or become global brands? In recent years, the question has changed in a small but important way. It is no longer a question of ability. Lenovo, Huawei, Haier, Qingdao, Sanyi, and Zoomlion have all proven that it is no longer possible to argue that Chinese companies cannot build global brands. There are now two more important questions: how and why. Chinese companies cannot afford to go global just for the sake of face. The process is punishing. It risks everything that a company has built here in China, and few Chinese companies still have the ability to make it work. For a long time to come, Most Chinese companies that venture beyond the borders of the PRC will do so because they have no other choice. But as marketers, we are expected to hold the answer to the second question. We are about to see a small flood of Chinese companies, large and small, leap onto the world stage, and many will come to us to help take their brands global. Here's the ugly truth. Most of us aren't ready to help. We have built tactics, techniques, and toolkits designed to make foreign companies successful in China. And most of our firms lack the foresight to create an entirely new craft around taking Chinese brands global. We need to get past that. The responsibility for the international success of Chinese brands rests on our shoulders. We will not succeed if we show up with old wine in new bottles.
Thanks, David. Welcome back to our studio. So for your book, you've interviewed experts like Tom Doctoroff, who like you also had a book banned in China, and David Wolf, and you talked about Chinese companies and their ability to build brands overseas. Can you talk specifically about a company that was not able to successfully break into the overseas market?
Sure, yeah, it's unfortunate. I just got the news that the book is blocked in China, but we're not letting that stop us. As you think about, what is a really good example of a Chinese company that just didn't get it right? I think one of the better examples of this is the story of Li-Ning, the athletic apparel company. For your viewers, that they're probably very familiar with the company and the founder who lit the torch at the 2008 Summer Olympics. But what some people might not realize is 2 years later, after the Olympics, Li-Ning went to the United States, to Portland, Oregon, right across from Nike, directly competing with them. And the thing was, their strategy was kind of flawed from the outset, and it was a lot of it was due to mismanagement of many of the relationships that I just mentioned earlier. Quite frankly, they went out with a pretty lean staff of just about 28 employees, so fairly limited investment. And as a result, most of the decisions about the company strategy were being made here in Beijing instead of on the ground in China. That then resulted in products that just really weren't matched for the local audience. I mean, Time actually wrote a great article where they did an interview of some of the executives there, and they looked at what was actually in the store in Seattle, and they said things that were being marketed were things like badminton rackets, ping pong paddles, kung fu gear. I mean, there were the exceptions of basketball sneakers, but overall these were things that were not really geared for an American audience. The other side is looking at kind of how they manage their local staff. There's a story actually of one of their top design engineers who, he was promoted at the local level. They wanted him to actually come to Beijing and take on a global role. So they announced it to the entire staff. He accepted the job. Everyone was happy. And a few weeks later, the Beijing management actually said they didn't agree. They didn't want him to come. So he ended up successfully suing headquarters here for $1.25 million in the United States. So, for a variety of reasons, after about 3 years, they had to pull out. And not only were they facing increased competition here with people like Nike and Adidas, but then also rising competitors from, local threats like Anta.
So really, in some ways, you see that as a distraction. Perhaps with their local business even, they should have been focusing on shoring up their resources and strengthening their brand here before they started expanding overseas.
Exactly. At the time, they had a really good opportunity to essentially go from some of these second and third tier cities and really assert their dominance in first tier cities against some of these global players. Ultimately, they were distracted by the opportunity overseas, and I think it probably cost them over the long term.
And at the same time, there are success stories. So tell us about a specific example of a Chinese company that has successfully expanded overseas.
Yeah, so first I think as you look at the successes, I think they're really going to be the exception at this stage. We are very early in this phenomenon, and there's a lot of learning that has to be done. But if I were to point to one, I'd point to Lenovo. And this isn't just the acquisition that they did with the ThinkPad line, but they've had successful international acquisitions in countries like Germany, Brazil, and then beyond the acquisitions themselves, they're really taking a global approach to their business. They're bringing in managers that have worked for companies like Apple, companies like IBM, companies like HP, and really giving them, true management authority at their business. So their management team actually has people from the US, Europe, and all over Asia, which is pretty unique for a Chinese firm. Just full disclosure, Yang Yuanqing endorsed my book, the CEO of Lenovo, but they had absolutely no say over kind of how the book was shaped. But the reason why I spoke to them was, quite frankly, I think they've done a good job not just just being a Chinese company that's gone global, but they've done a really good job positioning themselves as a global firm in the international marketplace.
So decades ago, the Japanese brands, Sony, Mitsubishi, were the first to sort of break out in the North American market. In recent decades, we've seen the Korean brands, especially Samsung, of course, but also Kia in motor cars as well, moving up the ranks. Do you see a point in the near future where Chinese brands really start to achieve the same sort of brand awareness and brand equity around the world?
In the near term, no. I mean, I think we will see some exceptions, but I think David Wolf actually said this great in a quote when he was talking a bit about a joke that industry professionals have here, which right now the mindset among Chinese executives is, branding is the equivalent of changing your logo. Advertising is essentially buying ads on China Central Television, and PR stands for pay the reporter. So it's not strategic. All of your marketing is being tied to that next product and not to building a long-term strategic asset. But I think things will change over the long term. One of the key points in the book is, as Chinese companies go west, so are Chinese individuals. So right now you see a massive boom in Chinese outbound tourism. You also see a substantial increase in Chinese studying abroad and Haigui coming back here. So as these individuals come here and rise up through these organizations, especially as you look at state-owned companies that will never have a foreigner run their organizations anytime soon, you will start having more globally oriented firms. But this isn't happening tomorrow. It's certainly not happening a few years from now. It will seriously take a generation, but it's not insurmountable.
And if we've learned anything over years in China is that their ability to learn and adapt and accelerate the process that we see overseas is something that definitely needs to be respected.
Exactly.
Thanks very much, Joel.
Thank you, Trevor.
That wraps it up for today. Be sure to subscribe to us on Youku, Tudo, and YouTube. You can also follow us on Weibo, WeChat, and Twitter, and join our LinkedIn group. We'll see you again.